However, they are all short in stature, and there's a crowd ahead of them. Now, the short in stature simply means that you're falling short in some way to be able to reach Christ. It doesn't literally mean that you are not tall. That's not what it's about. It means that something in you is forcing you to fall short of being able to find Christ. And at the same time, there is a crowd of people which are blocking you. And this crowd of people is your ego, your desires, your lower desires, and all of these things that block you from the pure virgin consciousness where you give birth to the Christ within yourself. Just as Christ was born of the Virgin Mary, the reflection of the literal story is a reflection of your inner story and is a reflection of the journey of the sun in the night sky, which is born out of Virgo. Jesus was born out of the Virgin Mary, and so too the Christ in you must be born from a place of clean consciousness. Hey guys, I thought I would share with you a very short but interesting and profound teaching which comes from the Bible and is encoded. Again, as I always try to show in my life and how I perceive this is, if a certain man did a certain thing thousands of years ago in the desert or in the Middle East or Mesopotamia, excuse me, then what reflection on my life has that got today? And sometimes the stories taken literally, they can input a great deal into our lives, and I take a great deal from the literal direct translation of these texts. But because I have gone away from the Bible as the only Gospels, because there are over 50 other Gospels that are not in there, then I have begun to understand how to read these stories and see what was being said about us today. Now, in Luke 19 in the Bible, I'll read it for you. And Jesus entered and passed through Jericho, and behold, there was a man named Zacchaeus, which was the chief among the publicans, and he was rich. And he sought to see Jesus, who he was, but he could not for the press, because he was little of stature. And he ran before and climbed up into a sycamore tree to see him, for he was to pass that way. And when Jesus came to the place, he looked up and saw him, and said unto him, Zacchaeus, make haste and come down, for today I must abide at thy house. And he made haste, and came down and received him joyfully. And when they saw it, they all murmured, saying that he was gone to be a guest with a man that is a sinner. And Zacchaeus stood and said unto the Lord, Behold, Lord, the half of my goods I give to the poor. And if I have taken anything from any man by false accusation, I'll restore him fourfold. And Jesus said unto him, This day is salvation come to this house, for so much as he also is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man is come to seek and to save that which was lost. There's more to that, but that tiny little passage tells you so much about what humanity is facing today and was facing back then. Zacchaeus is a chief among the people, and he is a wealthy, rich, powerful man. But despite the fact that he has all of this wealth and power, he has a desire to see Christ, to see Jesus. He desires to see him. But he can't see him because of the crowd, and this story says he's short in stature. Every person somewhere inside them has a desire to find God. Every person has it. We have on this planet expressions of evil. However, I've learned in my life that actually evil is not something people tend to set out to do when they are young or when they start to do it. It tends to be that they set out to do a certain action and then they justify the action, which is then leading towards that which we would morally, with our human moral compass, deem to be evil. However, they might say the ends justify the means. And thus, on our planet, in our present day at the moment, we have this certain personages on the planet who are probably in a very difficult position for human beings, who are in charge of our governments, who are in charge of these societies, who are in charge of these massive banks and corporations. And they have become so polluted and so materially focused that we have all begun to, perhaps wrongly, as we are not supposed to judge, but judge them to be a force which is dark and evil. However, this is saying that even the chief of the people, even the wealthy, somewhere in them there's a spark to find Christ. And it's there. However, they are all short in stature, and there's a crowd ahead of them. Now, the short in stature simply means that you're falling short in some way to be able to reach Christ. It doesn't literally mean that you are not tall. That's not what it's about. It means that something in you is forcing you to fall short of being able to find Christ. And at the same time, there is a crowd of people which are blocking you. And this crowd of people is your ego, your desires, your lower desires, and all of these things that block you from the pure virgin consciousness where you give birth to the Christ within yourself. Just as Christ was born of the Virgin Mary, the reflection of the literal story is a reflection of your inner story and is a reflection of the journey of the sun in the night sky, which is born out of Virgo. Jesus was born out of the Virgin Mary, and so too the Christ in you must be born from a place of clean consciousness. Now, he couldn't even see the Christ because these people, this crowd of people, were blocking his way. He couldn't physically see Christ. So he ran. Now, back in that time, it was actually culturally a terrible thing to run. In public, it wasn't okay. So for him to run in public was actually a form of humility, because in his desperation to see Christ, he went against the pointing finger of the public persons who say, hey, he's running, this is very ungentlemanly, this is very, this is just not societally correct, but he did it anyway. And he ran towards the sycamore tree and climbed the sycamore tree. Now, the sycamore tree is a fig tree, and I've said about this before, there are two ways trees are often defined inside the mystic language. One is they represent high places, higher levels of consciousness. So to climb a tree does represent that you're climbing the levels of consciousness. So you're ascending up through the levels of consciousness. But when a fig is involved, you begin to understand something very profound. A fig fruit is an inwardly blossoming flower. It's an unusual fruit, and just as we humans need to blossom inward, we have to go in and blossom inside, just as a lotus is represented. Then we need to go in, blossom inside of ourselves, and to do that, or what that means, shall we say first, is that you start to embody the teachings of someone like a master like Jesus Christ, and you begin to work on your moral governance within yourself, on your empathy, on your love, on your compassion, on your inner senses as well as your outer senses, and you keep growing until you have a very pure space inside yourself, and you blossom inwardly, a flower that blossoms inward, and you produce the fig fruit within yourself. Now, this is not only related to Christianity, because if you look at Buddhism, then you see that the Buddha enlightened beneath the Bodhi tree, and the Bodhi tree is a fig tree. And of course he enlightens as the star rises in the east, because the east, the right, is always the right hemisphere. As you raise your energies, as you blossom inwardly in meditation, as you blossom inwardly in service to others, as you blossom inwardly with purity and pure thoughts and love for your fellow man and love for your neighbour and love for your family and love for God above all else, then you begin to enlighten yourself, and then your energies come from your right hemisphere. The star rises in the east as the Buddha is meditating under the fig tree as he blossoms inwardly. And it's the same in the faith, in the Hindu faith as well, where you have the upturned tree with the roots facing out and the leaves of Vedic hymns, and it's a fig tree again. It's all about blossoming inwardly. So Zacchaeus runs, he humbles himself in front of the crowd, he climbs the tree, and he goes up in the stages of consciousness and he blossoms inwardly. And what happens? Jesus sees him. Christ has seen him for his hard works, for his humility, for his raising of consciousness, for his blossoming inwardly in meditation and the service to others, and being as Christ asked you to be like Christ, to live a life of righteousness and service as best as you can, as discipline as best as you can, and away from the lower qualities of yourself. And when Christ sees him, he says, I'm coming into your house. And what is your house? Your house is you when you go into yourself in meditation. So he's raising through those levels of consciousness, as we have in Greek mysticism, earth, water, air, fire. And as he's going through those beta, alpha, theta, delta, as he goes through those brain cycles, as we know, Christ is the one who baptizes you with fire. So when Christ comes into your house, you've risen yourself up to theta. And when you get to theta, Christ has come into your house and he does baptize you with fire, because you reach the fourth level of human consciousness in Greek mysticism, which is fire. And Zacchaeus, sitting there at this point, realizes all that Christ has taught, finds the faith and the strength in all that Christ has said, and does exactly what Christ told us all to do, to give as much as you can to the poor, because you don't need the safety blanket of having numbers in your bank account and all of this material necessity, when you know and you have the knowing that Christ and God is with you. And I know that from personal experience, because in my own life, when I got to that point in my consciousness and I had an absolute knowing of God, it's exactly what I did with my life. I went to Africa and I gave everything I had away, and within 6 months God restored it tenfold, and I gave that away and he kept restoring it to the point where we are now, where we've helped countless thousands of people. So I know from experience that it works, and I know exactly what happened to Zacchaeus, because Zacchaeus raised through those levels of consciousness so as he could see over his thoughts, his ego, the crowd, because he was short, because he didn't have the ability to see Christ because of his shortcomings, not because of his physical stature, and he blossomed inwardly as the fig does. And then Christ looked upon him and said, I'm coming into your house. And into his house he went, and as he was baptized with fire, because that's the point where Christ comes in, he then, at that stage in proceedings, gave half to the poor, because he understood what Christ had said, and he had the faith and the clarity in his heart to be able to do what Christ had requested of him. And he also said that he would give forth fourfold anyone he defrauded, and that's a Hebrew thing. They had a tradition where you would give X amount of what you had harmed someone with in business if you were caught doing it, and he increased that fourfold. I say that relates to the fourfold human nature, and the fact that he has finally surrendered his fourfold human nature over to the divine guidance of Christ and of Mother, Father, Creator. And oh, what a powerful and wonderful story it is when you understand the mystic side of it. And even without it, it's a powerful story that a loving teacher would come along and sit with a sinner and dine with a sinner and go into his house and with his grace and love turn him around to God. So if you take it literal, that's fine. But for me today on this planet, as I look around us, I see that predominantly the thing that's stopping all of us and most of our society from reaching God is the fact that they are too short and they can't see over the crowd. They have shortcomings in their discipline and they can't get beyond their ego and their lower mind. And thus, they need to humble themselves, run. They need to raise themselves up, raise that energy up by doing good service to others, by meditating, fasting, praying, taking no thought for your life, which is ultimately what meditation is, and raising that energy up inside of yourself so as you go into the higher brain cycles and the higher vibrational state that humans are entitled to access to be able to find God in the depths of prayer. And as he does it, he blossoms inwardly, just as the Buddha did. And just as the Buddha became enlightened and reached nirvana, so too he became enlightened, because nirvana is the place where you meet Christ, because it's the state of absolute thoughtlessness, but not in a negative sense of being thoughtless, but as an absolute state of profound divine silence. And as you get to that point, and you are absolutely 100% centered here, now, in the present moment, that's where you will meet Jesus Christ. And more importantly, at that point, when you know Christ, when you know it, absolutely know it, as what happened to I when I was on my long water fast, and I knew from that point on, I knew God was with me. And that's why I knew when God said go to Africa, he would look after me in some which way, shape or form. And as any of you out there now would feel boarding a plane to go to Africa on your own and giving up your whole life because of something you felt God had said to you using a synchronicity, it was terrifying. But I always looked back upon the fact that when I'd been up inside my fig tree, Christ and Jesus, or however you want to deem it, the Mother, Father, Creator, had called on me and said, I'm coming into your house. And indeed, when they came into my house, I got to that point where I understood the teachings completely. I understood that if you have enough faith, God will restore that which you share with those in need. And today, right now, if someone is suffering and someone is in pain and someone needs medication and someone needs food, and we have idle numbers and idle material goods sitting around us that don't serve ourselves and could end that suffering or feed that hungry person or clothe and house that child, then right now, those who act in faith will act. 100%. We will act. And most people who have that ability to act have at some point climbed that sycamore tree and they've blossomed inwardly like a fig and they've met Christ. And once you've met Christ, once you know you're close to unstoppable. So that's the importance of the mystic interpretation of Zacchaeus. A man climbed a tree thousands of years ago. It doesn't affect me today. It's a nice story, but for me today, on my personal journey, to understand all of what I've said there, that's a game changer. That changes everything for me. And it did change everything in my life. And I hope it can change everything in someone else's life once they get away from studying and hearing the verses, etc., and going into the practice and actually climbing the fig tree. Because that's the important part. God bless, guys. I love you all. And as you can see, I'm feeling a bit brighter and breezier from my treatment. So God willing, that will continue.